travel is getting better for like Midwest artists, because it used to be that like being an artist in the Midwest was like a stigma, or like you were from nowhere. But now like things have really shifted to the point where I think like you're almost like exotic or something, and there's like a fascination with where you're from. So you don't have to be like embarrassed anymore about telling people where you're from. That's a major part of our content, you know, being from the Midwest and like dealing with the sort of psychology of this place that we're in, you know.
We had to embrace it though. I mean, it wasn't something we've always worked with, you know, it kind of evolved in our work, and then I think we were like, okay, this is happening, you know. And no, I don't really think of it as, yeah, I guess I'm starting to not think of it as a handicap, but I think maybe at one point I would have.
But it's sort of in relation to the rest of the world, you know. I mean, it's not like a really hermetic view, you know. It's influenced by the travel that we do, and it's influenced by the fact that we have access now to the rest of the world through the internet and through everything else. You know, I mean, so it's not like it's like a different kind of regionalism that we sort of learned about in our industry. You know, it's also not like necessarily like a celebratory regionalism. Like I think a lot of these sort of people you think of as regionalist artists, a lot of that work was really celebratory of the region, and I think for us it's more of like a sort of sincere kind of delving into the idea of this place and the feeling of this place, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. We're specifically shooting these sort of Midwestern characters in a Western landscape, and for me it's sort of a misread to think of it as like a sort of a narrative about Midwesterners moving west, or settling in the West. It's more that the West is this sort of kind of anti-Midwest, or this sort of like unconscious, opposite of the Midwest. So
Discovery of the place really influences what we end up doing. And so like when we went to Death Valley, we spent like the first 2 days just kind of driving around and like location scouting and making all these discoveries, like that there was not, you know, miles and miles, endless like sand dunes in Death Valley, but that the sand dunes were actually this fairly small area with tons of people like all over them, like
and
tourists.
Footprints all over the place.
And that also Death Valley was itself is a relatively small contained area with all these very distinct kind of micro environments. And so that was very interesting too to discover. And then just kind of like a climate change in altitude and all of these, you know.
And the presence of the mountains, you know. I mean, we were staying 2,000 feet above Death Valley, so we had snow on the day we left. And you know, I even though we knew that ahead of time, like the whole time I was imagining like being in the desert, but we spent most of the time outside of the desert, really. When we went to Utah, when we went to the Salt Flats for our residency there, we had come up with all of these ideas for things we were going to do on the Salt Flats, and kind of using the white of the Salt Flats as this sort of white backdrop that we were going to draw on and do all these things. And basically almost all of our ideas were based on that, like sort of using the Salt Flats as a canvas. When we got there, it was all flooded. So the Salt Flats were under, parts of it were all mud, like gray mud, and then parts of it were just miles and miles of like 2 inches deep water. So we were just completely back to the drawing board. You know, we had 10 days, you know, so we
and that's actually where we ended up, you know, we loaded the van with materials that we had planned on using, and like in one corner we had shoved the costumes from our characters, and then it ended up that when we went out there and our expectations were so shifted, we kind of pulled those costumes out and we're like, well, let's work with these characters. And that ended up being like a super important thing for us to do, and like a big sort of shift in our trajectory. So yeah, so I mean that's a good example of where, like, if we had tied ourselves too closely to our expectations, we might have, you know, driven all over Utah looking for the perfect salt flat or something, instead of just kind of working with what we had there and letting it influence.
This time when we went to Death Valley, we basically said, you know, okay, we're going to do a little bit of preliminary brainstorming, but we're not going to tie ourselves to that, and we're also not even going to bring anything really for props. We're just going to bring the costumes, and we're going to very intentionally let the landscape inform the work, and let what we find there inform the work. So we kind of limited ourselves to only props that we found on site or within that location. So in that sense, it became a much closer kind of collaboration with place.
And I think too, we've also recognized that there's a little bit of an arc, like a learning curve when you're at these residencies, where you kind of have to spend the first couple of days just getting yourself oriented and figuring out where locations are that we could get props from, and who might be people that would help us with questions and things that we need to do, and then location scouting. And then there's always this kind of where you start out and you do a few experiments, and then you get to this point where you're like, oh my God, we only have a couple days left. We got to scramble and get all these ideas done. And then you never quite get everything done. But when you get home, you always realize you did so much more than you thought you did. So it's an interesting arc. And so far, we've only done short residencies because we haven't been able to leave town for several months or a year, which I think we'd like to work up to. But they've basically just been 2-3 week long residencies. So
for a long time, our resume was this whole list of Milwaukee shows, and that was sort of a weak spot on our resume. But it was also, it just, it really kept us thinking a lot about maybe we should move somewhere else. Maybe we need to go somewhere else. But I think that we've begun to come up with this kind of solution where we can stay in Milwaukee, where it's kind of a nurturing place to work. We can have a relatively cheap studio. There's a good art community, but we don't have to necessarily only show in Milwaukee. We can actually have a practice that expands beyond that. So I think we've really been kind of focusing on trying to get shows in other cities, get residencies in other cities, but also kind of maintaining somewhat of a presence in Milwaukee as well.
But it's, no matter where you live, even if you live in the art center of the world, which, I don't know, New York, Paris, wherever that is, you're going to get to a point where it's probably going to taper off in terms of how much inspiration you can draw from that place. And I think, no matter who you are and where you live and how big your art practice is or something, traveling somewhere else is always going to give you a new perspective. So, but I agree. I think it's one thing that, we've kind of got a nice infrastructure set up here in terms of being able to make our work, like Brent said, kind of fairly inexpensively, and get things going. We've established some, a lot of partners here that we can work with. But no, it's really exciting to be able to also go other places and sort of draw that into the work. And I think what we're doing right now is kind of an interesting collaboration of site, because we are these we're really thinking about what it means to be Midwestern, and then going to other places and exploring. I guess so far it's just been out in the Western landscape, but maybe we'll go to.
Yeah, I think that'll expand.
Yeah.
I've been thinking a lot about Texas,
right,
and Antarctica.